Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies, we're a couple of minutes late. Yeah, good afternoon. It's a balmy afternoon as well, isn't it? But that's enough about the government. Welcome to this meeting of the North Somerset Council Executive. I'm Councillor Steve Bridger, leader of the council. I'd like to welcome everyone to this face-to-face meeting of the executive in the new council chamber. There is an option to join the meeting via Microsoft Teams for those councillors and officers who are unable or do not feel comfortable attending the meeting in person. They will be able to take part, but will not be in attendance formally if they're taking part on Teams, that is. We are streaming today's meeting live, and a recorded version will be available to view within 48 hours or so on the North Somerset Council YouTube channel. So thank you. I will move to the formal agenda. Item 1, addresses by members of the public. Nick, I don't think there are none. Item 2, apologies for absence. I think we have one. Yeah, Councillor Ash Cartman. Can I think everyone else is here, can I ask my executive colleagues to introduce themselves, please, as a way of getting the rest of the attendance in line, starting with you, Mike?
Yes, hello, I'm Councillor Mike Bell. I'm the Deputy Leader of Council and the Executive Member for Adult Services, Health and Housing.
Councillor Mark Caniford, the Executive Member responsible for placemaking and economy.
Hello, Bridget Petty, Executive Member for the Climate Emergency and Engagement.
Councillor Catherine Gibbons, the Executive Member for Children's Services, Lifelong Learning and Skills.
Steve Hogg, Executive Member for Highways and Transport.
Mike Solomon, Executive Member for Neighbourhoods and Community Services.
Thank you very much indeed, colleagues. Moving on, item 3, which is Standing Order 37, which we all know is Declaration of Disclosable Pecuniary Interests. Are there any? There are none of those. Item 4, minutes of our last meeting, which was held on the 7th of September. Again, looking at colleagues, assuming there are no comments or amendments. Looking for a colleague to propose. Thank you, Mike. Acceptance of the minutes as the correct record. Seconder. Mark, thank you. All those in favour? Thank you very much. I'll sign those in a second. Item 5, non-executive councillors' addresses. Nick, I don't think we received any. Thank you for that. Item 6, matters referred to the executive and not dealt with elsewhere on this agenda. None of those. Rushing through. Item 7, West of England sub-region. Items not dealt with elsewhere on the agenda. Ditto, isn't it? None of those. So item 8 is the forward plans. This is a 4-month period commencing the 1st of next month. I think this was published beginning of this month on the 3rd of October. Again, on the record and for noting, so unless there are any questions, colleagues, no. Everyone happy that we note those? Thank you very much. Moving on to the first substantive-ish item, which is item 9, Local Plan 2038, an update following further consideration by informal place policy and scrutiny panel. So as colleagues will know, we at our last meeting on the 7th of September, the executive resolved to ask Councillor John Crockford-Hawley, who's chair of the place policy and scrutiny panel, to convene a scrutiny session so we could seek wider and deeper input, I think, from members on our options and report back to us. John can't be with us this afternoon. I hope you're recovering well, John, if you're listening in later. We have received a written reference note from John, from Scrutiny, which I think has been circulated to all councillors. So I'd like to formally note those comments from scrutiny, and additionally just make a few more comments. We've also received further legal advice, which we sought, and officers have also done some further work that recognises the constrained nature of North Somerset. Officers will continue that work with the emphasis, I think, on continue, and we'll look at, I think, more detailed variations that might be possible around the current preferred options compared to a more constrained approach. So I think this will give us some clarifications, I think, particularly around the nuances around greenbelt development and protections for greenbelt and other sensitive sites, which will be brought forward in a future executive report. In the meantime, we may, or hopefully we will, receive some greater clarity from central government on changes or possible changes to national planning policy, which will bring more certainty, hopefully, and to which we will obviously have an opportunity to respond and weave into any document that comes to a future executive meeting. I think the most important thing, I think that we all agree, is that we submit a plan that's robust, responsive to our own views and those of our communities, and that we can fully support. So that's what we're working towards. I'm not sure if there are any additional officer comments at this point. No. So, colleagues, are you happy to note scrutiny comments and we'll move on? Thank you very much indeed. Item 10 on the agenda is month 5 budget update. So we've obviously received apologies from Councillor Ash Cartman, who can't be with us this afternoon. So I'd like to ask our Director of Corporate Services, Amy Webb, to... Where is Amy? Oh, you were hidden. Sorry. To just summarise the report update, please, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the month 5 forecast outturn for the 22-23 financial year, and is a follow-on report from that presented at previous executive. So if I can take you to page 34 in your packs, the headlines on the revenue budget are outlined in the paper there. So it outlines that the net expenditure of the council is expected to be £185 million for the year. In terms of budget, unfortunately at this stage we have a forecast of £4.391 million overspent. That means we're expecting to spend more than we have available in resources. And it has actually worsened since we last reported at month 4 by £400,000 in terms of delivering services. We have identified a series of mitigations within the budget to help offset some of those pressures. And those have increased by 856,000. So offsetting that 400,000 and contributing a little bit more in terms of the overall position. So the report goes on to outline the specific pressures being experienced in more detail, in particular those you'll all be familiar with around energy costs, other cost of living pressures, including wages. The executive have obviously already tasked officers with progressing energy saving measures in order to mitigate against some of those price increases that we're experiencing. Just also wanted to note that pay awards are obviously subject to a national agreement, and that process is going through. Obviously, that does put pressure onto our budgets as a council, but that pay award, when it is agreed by unions through the collective bargaining process, would be very welcomed by our staff who are awaiting that kind of cost of living payment and top up. So moving on to page 38, section 3.1 talks about those mitigations, which I highlighted. Those are the actions that we're taking to deliver a balanced budget, which is the obligation of the council within the year. We have positive news that the mitigations will reduce the total overspend to £231,000, but that does mean that we're using reserves and our contingency budget. So if there are any more risks that are emerging throughout the year, that puts us in a really difficult position with reduced flexibility. we are working with finance colleagues and the rest of our leadership team in terms of bringing that to £231,000 down to zero by the year end. The rest of the report outlines the key risks to the revenue budget for the remainder of the financial year, and a lot of those will play across into our budget setting for future years. We then move on to the capital programme on page 43 and 44. There are some minor changes within the appendix in terms of changes to those schemes, and 2 proposed additions to the capital programme, which are the Junction 21 project and additional social care tech. So in summary, there are some recommendations in the report. The executive is asked to note the projected revenue and capital budget forecasts, and also the issues and risks that sit beneath them, approve in-year amendments to the revenue and capital budgets as detailed in the appendix, and also to note the financial risks carried by the council, which will have an impact on future monitoring reports and budgets. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Are there any questions from non-executive members?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that Councillor Ashton?
I've got my hand up. Sorry, Luna. Yes, can I have a question to the Director? On page 53, it reports a forecast outturn variance of 224%. I can't for the life of me work out what that means unless there's something else that's been hidden. It may just be a glitch, but I don't see why. And then on the matter for the forecast, the deficit of 4.5 million, well, that on your page 60 already says that that's covered by the 1.5 million revenue contingency and £3 million of reserves. I was hoping that some of the savings you mentioned earlier was coming off what you'd need to take from reserves, but it sounds from what you said, you're still looking to use £3 million worth of reserves to balance this year's budget. Where does that leave the figures for the following year if you're carrying forward that sort of deficit? And what does it do to our overall reserves position?
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Ashton, could you refer me back to the page where you were talking about the percentage? 53, thank you.
Page 53, right-hand column at the top, it says 224% forecast outturn variance.
Okay. So in terms of the mitigations, yes, some of the mitigations identified are utilising the in-year contingency budget and some financial risk reserve. So, for example, we are taking a risk-based approach to energy prices, that we're not expecting the trajectory to continue beyond the next financial year in terms of energy pricing. So considering an element of that cost to be hopefully one-off that we can fund through reserves. We do, of course, recognise the impact that that will have on the council's position, and we need to work through the reserves implication to ensure that we have enough sufficient to cover risks, both in this financial year and the future financial year. So hopefully that risk level has been articulated within the report.
So you would use the reserves for one-off costs rather than ongoing costs?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Ashton. Any more comments from non-executive members? I don't think so. No. Any comments from colleagues? No. Amy, can I thank you and Mel and your team for your continued work on this? Much appreciated. So in Councillor Ash Cartman's absence, I think I will propose those recommendations. So looking for a seconder. Mike, thank you. All those in favour of the recommendations as stated? Thank you very much. I assume Catherine's in favour too. Thank you. Moving on to item 11 on the agenda, update and cost of living working group. So I think as we've just heard, obviously the council is buffeted by some inflationary pressures and seeing our costs escalate beyond our available budgets. And we know the cost of living crisis is obviously causing huge strain on many residents. So hence we felt it was important to bring this item to the executive. Emma Diaku. Emma's our Head of Business Insight Policy and Partnerships. Emma, can I invite you to perhaps introduce this report, and then I'll go to Councillor Mike Bell. Emma.
Of course. Afternoon, everybody. So this is a bit of an overview on where we are with the work of the Cost of Living Working Group. Hopefully members will be familiar with it. We did an all-member briefing. Gosh, it's got to be going on for about 6 to 8 weeks ago now, but I know not all members could attend. So we wanted to send a bit of an update round just to let you know what's happened since we did that briefing. And it's all in the report, so I won't go through all of it, but just some updates. As you know, we were keen that we put together a bit of a cost of living action plan, and that work's been ongoing. It's been led by the Cost of Living Working Group. And just by way of an update on that, we have about 60 members within that group now, and they cover a breadth of different organisations. Obviously, us, the local authority, health colleagues, community groups. We've got vans, for instance, Citizens Advice. So it's a really robust group, lots of interest, lots of goodwill about getting involved in it and really getting stuck into some of the issues coming up here. So we have a cost of living action plan now, which I've outlined in the report on page 3, which talks about the different areas within that action plan, which includes household support, vulnerability of housing, financial well-being, food insecurity, energy insecurity, as Amy referenced within the MTFP paper. Ongoing work around digital exclusion, the work of our communities and the support being given there, mental health, access to information and guidance, and some ongoing work around communications as well, and opportunities for project funding. And as would be expected, there's lots of crossover between those different groups. So we are planning to share that action plan imminently with our citizens panel to get some feedback from our residents, to make sure we've picked up across the various different themes, that we haven't missed anything obvious, and just to get a bit of thoughts from them as well. You'll note in the paper that I've put some of the national research in that's recently come out from the ONS, which talks about some measures around how people feel about cost of living changes, whether they're able to pay their bills, worries about energy and so on. So this is an opportunity for us with our citizens panel as well to do a bit of benchmarking with that. So we're hoping to get that out in the next citizens panel survey, which is late October, early November. I've also popped some information within the report around some of the projects that are up and running at the moment, and I wanted to update you today just on the Public Living Rooms project, which is one of the key ones that we've been focusing on over the last several weeks. Hopefully, everybody will be familiar with this. It's been in the news a lot. Martin Lewis, a money-saving expert, has released some guidance and advice for councils and community groups to use, and we were able to identify a bit of funding to go into that. Not new money, it was money we already had earmarked for community projects. Where we are at the moment is we've had 23 applications in for that grant funding across 29 different groups. We've looked at some of those. We've already provided some of that funding out based on the scoring. We're speaking to partners about some additional monies to come into those parts, and we're working with our libraries as well to ensure that there's some warm places within those. We're also working on a bit of a map, which will be on our website. So if you're a resident or a community group, you can identify on that map exactly where you're able to go in and find a warm space. So that's one of the key projects at the moment. There are obviously other ongoing projects that we're looking at. We also have a communications plan, which has been shared with the group and the panel, and that's got some focused thematic work over the next few months. So, for instance, with the half-term holidays coming up, there'll be some specific communications around that. When the children went back to school, we did some specific communications about banks where you could share and swap uniforms. So that theme will carry on throughout Christmas and into the new year. So that's a really quick whiz through. I think the last thing to say as well is just that we have this oversight panel in place now. The Cost of Working Living Group has grown so rapidly, and there's so much interest in it, that we've had to set up a bit of an oversight panel which can make quick decisions as new areas of work come in. And Mike Bell's very kindly chaired that for us, and I'm there as well with him as vice chair, and we have a number of our partners on there who volunteered their time as well. So we had the first meeting of that very recently, and they're every 2 weeks for the foreseeable future. So that was a very quick whiz through. Are there any questions or anything I can expand on that's in the report?
Thank you, Emma. I can't see any questions at the moment. Obviously, this item is for well, there is one, apparently. Councillor Havison, Karen.
Thank you. Yes, you didn't mention it, Emma, but I have seen our little leaflet that I've been distributing around various places, and it's the Worried About Money leaflet, which is really, really helpful. But I have had some concerns from some of the target audience that they find it actually very complex and with too much detail. So I was really hoping that maybe it could be for another edition, it could be streamlined a bit more, and because we're targeting clearly people who are not online, and those tend to be people who find forms and complex communications not that easy. So I was hoping that it could be simplified a bit. I know that we would lose some of the detailed information, but it could have links where those could then be followed out. So it's just two people have talked to me and said, I find this very confusing. I don't think I understand it. So I think it would be good if we could have another look at that.
Thank you, Councillor. So the Worrying About Money leaflet, as you say, has been one of the things that we've launched to provide some support for our digitally excluded population. That it was completely grant funded. We were able to get some cash in to pay for that. There was also a training element. It is due for review October now, so imminently, and we can pick that up and make sure that it's as easy to use and user friendly as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you, Emma. Before I go to exec colleagues, Mike, do you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Emma, for the presentation and update. And I think it's just worth reflecting that, as Emma said, in response to the cost of living emergency, we've pulled together this working group task force of organisations, individuals, groups from across North Somerset. I think it's more than 60 different organisations and individuals are involved in that already, which has been amazing. And likewise, the response from council officers has been immense as well. So Emma's team and Lorraine and Rachel, but officers right across different directorates pulling together. And I just wanted to say that a bit like in the COVID crisis, we should take comfort and inspiration and a cause for optimism from the fact that we can rally round and support each other as a community, and that even in testing and challenging times, there is help out there and there is a willingness and a capacity to get involved. I also just want to say it's yet again, just like COVID, an example of how critical local councils are and the staff that we have and the networks that we have in supporting people, because actually all of these teams have other jobs to do. You know, their day job is not providing support and financial interventions and mental health interventions for the community facing a cost of living crisis, not of anyone locally's making. They've got other things that they should be doing, and they're actually creating time and space and energy in order to focus on this and to step up and support the community. So it's a great credit to all of those that work for the council who, like the rest of the community, are also experiencing the same cost of living pressures. You know, so they're going through a tough time as well, but that's not stopping them or the voluntary organisations and social sector organisations from stepping up. So I think the big message for the community and for all elected members is, you know, there is help out there. It isn't always straightforward, Karen, you're right, unfortunately, and that's why please ask for help, because the earlier that you can ask for help, the earlier that you can get involved in some of these networks, the greater opportunities there will be to avert any of the worst possible effects of the current crisis. So big thank you to the officers and voluntary organisations that have been involved, and we'll keep doing our best, not just in the short term, but over the longer term, because clearly in the light of the global and national financial situation, none of this is going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for chairing the oversight group. Before going to Catherine and Bridget, it's a question from Councillor Don Davis. Don.
Hi, yeah, thanks. And I'd like to say, also reflect what Mike Bell has said about thanks to our staff. I was responsible for an organisation which put an application in which was processed very quickly and questions answered very quickly and professionally. So thank you to everybody that's involved with that. I guess my question is a wider one in terms of entitlement to support, because some of these cost pressures that people are experiencing are extremely wide-ranging and affect probably a far greater number of people than perhaps our support mechanisms previously have got involved with. And I just wonder, and I'm not expecting a particular answer today, but just acknowledgement we need to think about eligibility for support, because people with large houses may have quite a lot of money, could have incredibly large fuel bills they've got to pay. Because there's no cap of £2,500. That's just based on average bill, for example, isn't it? And that's running out next April now, it seems. So I do wonder whether how we mobilise support for a far greater demographic than perhaps we have previously done.
Thank you, Don. Mike.
That's a really important point that Don makes, and it is something that we have considered as part of the working group, because what we're definitely seeing, particularly through Citizens Advice and the other advice organisations, is a very different cohort of people coming and seeking support. So this is not just those who have traditionally been on low incomes and have been struggling, but actually much broader populations of people being drawn into it. So you're absolutely right, and it is something that we're thinking about. We have done some things already, so where we've got discretion over some of our funding pots, so particularly in terms of the Household Support Fund and also the council tax energy rebate earlier in the year, we did try to allow some flexibility so that it didn't just target those on the traditional categories of low incomes, but we also enabled a broader range of households to apply for support. But of course, as Don will know, one of the problems we've got is that we have very limited levers here, because when it comes to a lot of the financial support that we are responsible for administering, housing benefit, council tax benefit, and so on, a lot of that is set down by national legislation. But it's a really important point, and we'll absolutely keep working on that and making the case to government that they need to do more and differently.
Don, if I could just say as well, one of the outcomes of the working group so far has been the establishment of a bit of a subgroup, which is around the data and insight that we've got. So within the report, there are a couple of brief graphs which are from national data, but we're really keen that we've got a much more localised picture. So we have data sets here within the council, we have them within Citizens Advice, and this morning we were looking to get some health data through about mental health referrals. So we're keen to bring all of that together, which then at the very least gives us an opportunity to target some of our comms messaging. So as Mike said, while we might not have levers over some of the financial elements, there are some community elements that we're able to target a bit more smartly with our communications, and that's built into the comms plan as well. So that work will continue over the coming weeks.
Thank you, Emma. Catherine, sorry if I had to keep you waiting. I wanted to take questions from non-exec members first.
That's fine. In fact, Councillor Davis has asked a question that led to a response from Mike that covered a point I wanted to make about the fact that the cap is going to end in April and we have people facing £5,000 energy bills. The other point I wanted to make was to just reinforce what Councillor Havison was saying. I have had various people contact me, and I know it's one of my hobby horses, but I was going to bring this to the next oversight group and task force, is the need for us to produce our literature in an easy read format for a variety of groups of individuals. And I've had that request from young people as well, because they find a lot of our communication very complex.
So just for context, the Worrying About Money leaflet was part of a wider project, so it's the same format across all of the different local authorities, with obviously some specific tweaks for the fact that it's not Somerset Council, but yet that's noted. I'll pick that up with Lorraine and have a particular think about whether we need to do some targeted work for young people as well.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Catherine. Councillor Bridget Petty. Bridget.
Thank you. I think building on some things that Mike said around how our communities are coming together, both officers working across the council, either sharing things with each other, but also working very hard on the work around this subject. I think that, so what we've seen and what we need is to continue to work together and share things across our communities. The EAT festivals, at the moment we have, at our towns, we have these EAT festivals taking place, and at each of them there is going to be a stall from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, that's CSE, with good advice, tips and some things to take away to your house to make homes more energy efficient. And that's been supported by North Somerset Council. On Facebook groups like Reduce, Reuse, Recycle, people are sharing good ideas and tips and advice, and certainly I'm hearing on radio programmes. So I think that the community is coming together, and I wish that we weren't all in this situation, but we are. And but I think that if we can continue to share those good things, then that is a strength of our communities, and I'm proud of both villages and towns doing that across North Somerset already. If residents are starting to struggle with electricity bills, which I'm sure they are, and landlord bills, please do contact their providers and contact landlords before seeking funding elsewhere, such as unlawless payday loans and things like that. So I think do go back to your electricity providers and tell them how much you're struggling, I think is the advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Councillor Mike Solomon. Mike.
Yeah, I think the key word in this is very much community, and I have elderly neighbours that have been struggling to get online to do various things, and we've been helping them, and I think I would like to reach out to the whole community, and I'm hoping there's a few people watching today, to say this is what we can do. You know, us that are computer literate and we have a computer at home, if we've got elderly neighbours, we can certainly give them some help to do forms online, etc.
Thank you, Mike. Any further comments from colleagues? I've got one question, well, not sort of a question. Obviously, this report notes progress to date. I assume that we can bring further reports in future as we go through the difficult winter. So thank you, Emma. Thanks very much to you and your team. And I'd like to echo colleagues' comments and thanks to everyone involved with the Cost of Living Working Group and our North Somerset Together partners. I think this is partnership working at its best, I think, for the benefit of North Somerset residents. So thank you very much. So that's just for noting. So everyone happy with that? Moving on to item 12 on the agenda, which is living well with COVID. So this is a report from Matt Lenny, our Director of Public Health and Regulatory Services. Matt's here with us. Matt, can I ask you to introduce this report, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to do that. So the report's in front of you. I'll be very brief just to give an overview of why we've written the report and what some of the key messages are. I guess the important thing to recognise is it's marking a different phase in the pandemic. We're in a very different position to where we were, thankfully, about 3 years ago when we started on this journey. And we've seen incredible response, I think, from within the local authority and our partner organisations in trying to manage the risks around COVID. Particularly pay tribute to colleagues in adult social care, in the care sector, in schools, in our workplaces. We've seen a lot of community response to try and help us all mitigate the risk. But thankfully we are in a different place, and what the paper is trying to explain is that previously we had to produce something called a local outbreak management plan, which was our response back up to government to explain the different ways in which we were trying to manage the pandemic. Now that requirement ended in this financial year, but what we have done proactively is to produce an overview of what the current approach is and to describe the shift from more operational response now into a less proactive role for the local authority, and ultimately pointing to the fact that from April next year, when the funding ends for local authorities to have a health protection response, it will then default back into the previous system whereby the UK Health Security Agency, which formerly was Public Health England, leads on the infectious disease response. But at the local authority level, we assure ourselves that the response is appropriately handled. And if needed, we will get in and alongside our local settings to help them work with the UK Health Security Agency to make sure that the needs of their community are well managed. So that's the overview of it. And I think we'll continue to be obviously very interested in health protection, but it is about roles and responsibilities moving forward. So within the report, it just gives some assurance about the fact that we're continuing to work across 4 main areas. So one is around prevention. Now, most of the national measures, of course, have all been taken away in terms of the requirements to wear masks or restrictions in terms of people's movement. There are still some restrictions that might take place in certain controlled settings, particularly when an outbreak is in progress. And so we continue to work alongside those settings to support them, to explain that to anybody who might need to know, for example, care residents or their families, or indeed through schools if you're warning and informing people about an outbreak. And that's how it's always been in terms of health protection response. In terms of protection, of course, the vaccination programme has been the thing that has helped us to move out of the pandemic and to do that effectively. What we know about the vaccination programme so far is that it now targets the most vulnerable, so it's based on age and clinical vulnerability. We are seeing good uptake in that group, but if you look across the history of the pandemic, the people who have taken up the vaccine most effectively are people in the older age groups and those who are more vulnerable. What will be interesting to see over time, as the recall starts to go in for the younger, older aged adults, so all the way down to 50 plus, what the response will be like. In each wave of the vaccination programme, we've seen a slight waning in terms of uptake. So we'll need to see with this latest booster whether the majority of people over 50 will step forward based on the fact it's just their age rather than knowing they have a clinical risk. But the older age group have been very good in responding to that call and seeking that protection. And we do continue to monitor, and we will continue to monitor the uptake in the different age groups. There is a programme board across Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire that looks at the data, and we'll be looking to see if there are gaps and are there additional measures we need to put in place to try and encourage people to step forward, either by geography or by certain characteristics of their group that they're part of, how to reach people effectively and encourage them in. And quite often in the previous vaccination programmes, the voluntary and community sector have been key to that because they have reach into people and they have a credible voice with people to ask them to come forward and explain the benefits. The third area is around treatment, so that's very much a clinically led area of work, so that's for colleagues in the NHS, but what we're seeing now is with what we've learned about COVID over time and the adaptation of different medical interventions, particularly pharmaceutical interventions, we're seeing a more effective range of interventions being offered. So as people present with COVID, particularly those who've got more severe COVID, there are a lot more options for doctors to be able to treat those people effectively in hospital. And that is helping to get people better quicker and also reducing the risk of people sadly dying from COVID. And then finally, in terms of response, it's just assurance that, and it says within the paper, with the resources that we still have, we are still running a response team in the Public Health and Regulatory Services Directorate, and that's working alongside our colleagues, particularly in adult social care and children's, to be able to provide that reach into the settings, to be able to support schools or care homes or workplaces in understanding the guidance and applying guidance appropriately if they have an outbreak of COVID or indeed any other infectious disease, because the team are picking up on other things as well. But that particular support will come to an end at the end of April next year. What we're doing is working with colleagues in the UK Health Security Agency to make sure that we've got alternative ways that people can quickly access advice and support. Some of that will be about ringing helplines, but actually we're trying to improve the range of tools that are available online for people to quickly self-assess where they are in terms of a particular notification of disease or a particular outbreak, and then they'll be able to manage that more appropriately. I suppose the one thing we do have going forward is people are a lot more aware in the population about the risks of infectious diseases. People are much more proactive in terms of thinking about how you can do that in terms of washing hands and staying away from people if you've got a cough or a bad cold. And that does give us something to work with in terms of trying to reduce the risk of all infectious diseases, not just COVID, because it is sitting alongside a range of other risks, particularly flu, in this season that we're now going into. So would absolutely encourage anybody who is eligible for COVID or flu vaccination to step forward and to get that as soon as possible, because that is the most effective way of protecting you, your family and your loved ones and your wider community. But I think that's all I'll say on the report, but I'm very happy to take questions or comments on that if that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Matt. And I was going to ask you to restate that advice actually, but you just did at the end there. If you're offered a vaccination as we go into another winter with COVID still in the community, take up that offer. Any questions from colleagues? Mike.
Yes, Matt, do we get any information back on the severity of any, after effects of the injections now with the change and the strains changing, whether they're less severe than they were or more or whatever?
Yeah, so it's a very hard thing to measure because we don't routinely ask everybody after their vaccination, how did you feel afterwards and what happened to you? So you get a range of stories, don't you, from people from, it didn't affect me at all, to actually I felt pretty rough for a few days. But there are sample studies that look at some of that, and I think over time, as the vaccine is developed, it's become more acceptable because we've been exposed to it more times. So if you've been vaccinated once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, your body tends to have a better memory. You're learning how to deal with it more effectively. But it will range by individual case. So I think at the moment we're not seeing a significant issue about people's reaction to having a vaccine. But the advice is always, if you're not feeling great afterwards, do take time to rest. Don't try and do too much too quickly and listen to your body. If it's telling you to stop, then that's probably a good thing to do.
It doesn't have the same effect, though, as antibiotics, whereby the more you take, the less effective it's going to be, or is it a different sort of thing?
No, so in terms of vaccination, the effectiveness of the vaccine will wane over time, and different vaccines will wane over different time periods depending on what they're combating. But I suppose a nice analogy that was given to me in terms of building up your immunity, particularly if you've offered boosters, is your first dose is a bit like going to primary school, your second dose is secondary school, your third dose is going to university, and your fourth dose might be your master's degree when you're all over it. So if you've got the opportunity to continue to teach your body about how to react appropriately to an infection, that's a good way round.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mike. I know that Karen wants to ask a question, but this time I'll go to Catherine first, and then you, Karen, and then Steve Fogg. Catherine.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, in terms of the treatment section, and you refer to the long-term impact of COVID, what support and advice do we have for people who are suffering from long COVID? Because this is something that seems to be falling a little bit off the radar now that we're in a better place. And the other point I just quickly wanted to make is, yet again, to thank everyone in the voluntary sector and just to highlight that there's still a need for volunteers to come forward to act as stewards at the vaccination centres so that the current round of vaccination runs smoothly. So I'm just putting that out there for anyone who wants to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that call for volunteers. That's really important because it doesn't happen without that supporting people to get there. In terms of long COVID and the longer term impacts, so the studies continue and there are clinics that are offered through the NHS. So hard for me to kind of talk specifically about that, I suppose, because it's a different system, if you like, very much with a clinically led response. But I guess if anybody is feeling concerned or has any particular issues that they want to raise, I would suggest they go through their GP first, because GPs will be the access point for additional advice and support, and they'll be able to assess each person appropriately. But there is an infrastructure there that should be responding, and use your GP as the mechanism to make sure that you get the support you need.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Catherine. Councillor Havison. Karen.
Yes, thank you. I want to start by thanking Matt, who, as I seem to remember, was thrown into this pandemic just a few months after starting his post. So I think he's been well tried and tested and found to be dealing with it superbly. So thank you very much, Matt. There are some concerns I have when it comes to learning from this pandemic, because as we all know, this was an area where we knew practically nothing about how this virus spreads and how we need to treat it, to knowing an awful lot, fortunately, by now. But the keeping up with the latest scientific insights has been really, really slow in some cases nationally. And I'm wondering how much our hands are tied by national guidelines. And just to remind you, the initial inside was wash your hands, and then it emerged that this is an airborne virus and we need to avoid enclosed spaces. That took months before that was adopted nationally as advice. The second one was the symptoms, which changed very much with each new variant, and we were still stuck with the original variants, which were completely out of date, but we were still giving that advice. And the most up-to-date one now is that it's very obvious that vaccines hardly protect us from infection, but protect us very well from serious illness. So these three issues are very established in the scientific literature and community, but they don't seem to get as far as national guidelines. And I was wondering how much flexibility we as a local authority have in adding a bit of advice, not taking the original one away, but actually giving extra advice, because we should have enough medical knowledge in our midst to be able to assess the latest scientific research in this field. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so you raised an interesting point there about the relationship between local and national response. I think it is a difficult one because with advice, what we did learn through the pandemic was that the simpler and the clearer the advice was, and the more consistent it was, the easier it was for people to be able to process that, remember it, and respond to it. I think lots of individual local advice, and it is a judgment call, of course, and there were things that we were able to do with particular high-risk settings in advising them how to handle certain situations, work within the national guidance, but also be able to advise them more specifically about the situation they faced. But if you start to put lots of additional local advice on top of national advice, then people can start to get confused about which bit of advice they need to follow. I totally take the point about what the scientific advice is telling us and how quickly that learning is applied in terms of how national guidance and other things are developed. But I think that's something that we continue to represent back up to the national system to try and encourage as quick as possible that adaptation and that movement towards what science is teaching us in terms of what an appropriate response is. I guess one of the interesting things at the moment is the National COVID Inquiry has opened. Now that will take some time to work its way through. What is interesting though is the first module that they're looking at is all about response. So how quickly can we learn the lessons from what we've been through in the last 3 years and apply in terms of if something else happened, how would we do it differently? And I think this would be one of the areas. How quickly do you move from scientific insight into guidance? And hopefully that will help us to have a system that maybe will adapt much quicker and be more effective much earlier in terms of supporting people to manage risk appropriately. So I don't think that's a perfect answer, but I suppose what I'm saying is that there's something about us in a local system needing to be part of a bigger response, but hopefully some of the push around the inquiry will help us get better at this, because it has been quite a seismic learning curve for many people in many different parts of the system.
Yes, I think if we can take that forward to central government and encourage them to respond a little bit faster, I think people do understand that the thing has changed. So I think we maybe are a little bit condescending in believing that they cannot take a new message if the evidence emerges that things have changed. So, but yes, I totally understand where our situation as a local authority and how our hands are tied. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Councillor Steve Hogg. Steve.
Thanks. Well, I think Karen and Matt covered off the majority of what I wanted to say, but it was really around messaging and comms. And one of the things that I'm sort of anxious about, this is just anecdotal from my perspective, is that with all of the things that are happening currently, COVID is really slipping, I think, from the public consciousness quite a bit. I know that we've had some impacts, certainly amongst the bus driver population. We've got a lot of absences on the buses. When you present that as a reason why the bus may not turn up, you're almost met with sort of incredulity. But I don't know what we're doing to just keep it on the radar that it is still a thing, particularly as we head towards another winter. And I think COVID numbers are going up, I think, nationally, aren't they still?
Yeah, it's a difficult balance to strike, because I suppose it's all about the relative risk of COVID now. In terms of clinical outcomes, there are people being diagnosed with COVID, but thankfully we're seeing very few people get very sick with COVID now, and they tend to be people who are sick with other conditions anyway, and it becomes an exacerbating factor essentially. But the consciousness around COVID, I guess it's also true for flu as well, in terms of how quickly that can circulate and actually how devastating that can be for individuals or closed communities or families or whatever. I guess some of this is fatigue for people in the population, having been through a very difficult experience. There's an element of wanting to close that down in your mind, because you don't really want to think back to the way you had to live for a while and the impacts it may have had on you and your family and your community. So it is a difficult comms message to say stay alert when people actually want to hear it's all okay now. But I think as long as we can continue to have a positive conversation about, well, let's think about some of the risks that you do care about. So you wouldn't want your elderly relative to be in hospital very unwell because they caught something that could have been avoided. Or you wouldn't want your hospital or your GP surgery or your other point of access for health and care support to be so busy with things that could have been prevented that it stops somebody getting a good service. So I think maybe this is reframing a bit. Now, a lot of the communication this year has been about the winter and about managing the winter well. So it's a broader message about how we live well and live safely with each other at a time when more disease spreads and there's more risk in the population. We have been continually trying to give those messages, but I guess once you've gone past a major news event and a major kind of impact on people, it's sometimes harder to warm people up to that. But we will continue to try, and I guess I would just say to people, stay aware. It is about being kind to each other, which is what we said throughout the pandemic, and continued, sensible kind of view on how well are you and should you be out with other people, should you be in enclosed spaces, all of those things are still sensible bits of advice. But unfortunately, I don't think there is an easy answer to it, but we keep going, and maybe if we explain the impacts of not behaving in that way, that gives people a bit more of a reason to perhaps adjust their behaviour.
Thanks, Matt. Mike Bell, and then Catherine.
Thanks. There was just one thing I wanted to sort of mention, really, which hasn't been particularly reflected upon in this conversation, and that is what all of this underlines, and the entire COVID pandemic underlined for me, was how incredibly important health protection and more generally public health services are. The truth is that we went into a global pandemic with public health services that had been underfunded and undermined for several years. So our ability to respond to the challenges that colleagues have talked about, both during the pandemic and beyond, were really restricted and limited. And I recall everyone saying, one of the things we must learn from this process is how important it is to invest in health protection and public health services. And unfortunately, we haven't really seen that delivered by government so far. We know that, for example, in terms of our funding for the current financial year, in maintaining the kinds of things that Matt talked about at the very beginning and that are covered in the report, we're only able to do that because there was some money left over from some of the emergency COVID funding that came through during the peak of the pandemic. We also know that money is due to end in March, as if, of course, COVID is suddenly going to disappear completely at that point. And, of course, the critical lesson, which is about preparedness and making sure that you've got the expertise and the skill sets and the capacity to respond, does run the risk of being lost again. If we don't put in place the right kind of long-term investment. And of course, we saw that nationally, didn't we? Because Public Health England, who initially led with the Department for Health on the national response to COVID, clearly was not equipped to deal with it. It wasn't a true health protection agency, certainly in terms of an emergency response. That's where the UK Health Security Agency has come from and grown from. I've been a bit disappointed that it's felt a bit continuity Public Health England in some of its ways of operating. So I think what we must also do, as well as focusing on the importance of getting those messages out to communities and not taking our eye off the ball in terms of COVID, we must also keep making that point that without a sustained investment in health protection and health prevention and public health more generally, we will run the risk of just repeating these things, because this will not be the last pandemic that we ever have to deal with. And indeed, we don't even know for sure that we're completely out of COVID, and that there won't be future variants that will come along and challenge us again in the future. So it's an investment that we really can't afford to not be making as a nation.
Thank you, Mike. Catherine.
Thank you. Just another brief question. Obviously, we've talked a lot here about how fantastic the response from the communities were, and we have North Somerset Together existing and working with us in the cost of living crisis. And we talk about this being the cost of living crisis being something like COVID. The big difference there is that North Somerset Together was to support people, but the message during COVID was that we had to stay apart and we had to stay in our homes. We are now actively saying to people, you've got to come together in a public living room, you've got to come together and share things. So do you think in that context, the message about your health and not going out if you are ill, whether it's flu or whatever, is even more important, because quite a lot of vulnerable adults will be using our public living rooms. So we really need a different kind of messaging around health awareness and what to do.
Well, I think it's probably breaking down into two things, isn't it? There's immediate risk when somebody is infectious, so therefore staying indoors and getting better before you come back out. But the overall other message is absolutely the right one, because what we learned through the pandemic, of course, was there were certain health protection risks and certain health protection impacts in terms of illness, but there was a whole swathe of other impacts on the population, not least mental and emotional well-being. So the need for people to be connected and to be supported in their communities is an enormous part of our own wellness and our happiness, and a social approach to health, not just a clinical view of health, which is really important. So I guess it's saying to people, when you're not well, it's good to stay apart, but when you are well, be around people, particularly if you feel a bit isolated, a bit lonely. There are people out there who want to spend time with you and help you find things that make you feel good about yourself and feel more positive, and that's absolutely something to be encouraged. So it's a qualified message about a particular risk, but overall, let's have people getting back together.
Yes, thank you, because I think we spoke about it. I've had older residents who would like to access these community activities, but the message about COVID has been so strong and so powerful that they are still fearful of doing that kind of thing. Thank you.
And I think that's a difficult thing, and I can speak from personal experience in terms of my parents. My parents are still quite cautious. They're mid-80s. And my dad was a pharmacist for 50 years, so he knows a lot about infection. So I encourage him, but he makes a choice, and that's fine. But it's one of those things where having supportive conversations with people about helping them to work that through and make a good choice is absolutely true.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you, Catherine. Any more questions from comments? No. Matt, thank you very much indeed to you and your brilliant team, as always. I mean, you finished on a point of hope, I guess, around community, but I mean, just picking up on what Mike was saying, Mike Bell, it does look as if we are facing some really deep public service cuts again, and it's so depressing, isn't it? Because those cuts we know will be self-defeating. We know that it's false economy, austerity, less money means less staff, poorer quality, hollowed out services, for those who need it most, and more ill health and more inequality. We know that, don't we? And yet that's what we're facing. But thank you, Matt. Much appreciated. Okay, we'll move on to item 14 on the agenda, which is item 13 on the agenda, which is draft calendar of executive meetings for the next municipal year. This is a report from from Nick Brain on my left, who's our Assistant Director, Legal and Governance and Monitoring Officer. Nick.
Thank you, Chairman. Little to add to the report. As you know, we try to plan these meetings well in advance so that they can go into members' and officers' diaries, and colleagues can project plan accordingly and build in meeting dates when they need to for their projects. So suggested dates are there. There's a mix of afternoon and evening ones, as you requested previously. I commend those dates to you.
Thank you, Nick. Any comments from colleagues? Can we note Nick's report? Looking for some nods. Yep, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. Excuse me. Item 14 is oral reports from executive councillors. So, colleagues, I think I won't go around the room, but if you could indicate to me if you've got anything you want to share. I don't think we have. I mean, I about 20 minutes ago, I did hear someone's BBC News notification go off, and I did wonder what had happened, because if you're in back-to-back meetings these days, you do wonder whether you can be confident that there hasn't been some kind of U-turn that might have just undone what you might have just made a decision on, but I don't know what that was about, maybe some kind of football transfer or something. Anyway, thank you very much for everyone's attention. Any urgent business? Nick? None. So I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.